From becoming much more softer than the version from the game to making a lot of wiser decisions, HBO has really changed Joel's entire character, and here's how they did it. The Last of Us creator Neil Druckmann recently commented on the differences between Joel as portrayed in the games and Pedro Pascal's portrayal in HBO's series. According to Druckmann, Pascal's portrayal appears much softer than his game counterpart. Usually, fans hate it when too many changes are made in an adaptation, but this one has managed to garner much praise for being faithful to the original story while still adding some creative liberties that make it better suited for a TV show. In the game, both Joel and Tess are presented as ruthless survivors who often resort to violence to achieve their goals.
Quit your squirming. You were saying?
I sold him.
Excuse me.
I didn't have much of a choice. I owed someone.
You owed us.
They torture Robert in order to get information from him, but this dynamic is reversed in the show. When we first meet Robert and Tess, he has her in an interrogation room, and when Joel and Tess find Robert later on, he's already dead. By making this small but significant change to the plot, the show manages to make viewers sympathize with Joel and Tess despite the occasionally violent acts they commit. This is because video games are inherently different from movies and TV shows in that we are always in control of the player's character. That's not the only change the show has made. They changed the entire timeline. The Last of Us video game and television series both tell the story of a dangerous fungus that, as global warming intensifies, is able to mutate and infect humans. This leads to a zombie apocalypse that takes over the world. In the game, the pandemic begins in 2013, with the events taking place 20 years later in 2033. While in the show, the pandemic begins in 2003, and most of the plot happens in 2023, which is also the year that it was released. The creators wanting to set the plot in 2023 was probably a strategic decision, since The Last of Us is based on a very scientific and realistic concept of zombie infection. Having it set in the current year makes it more likely to have an emotional impact. This way, it's also easier for people to imagine the potential effects of global warming and the danger that comes with it. Another big change was Tess's death in the second episode. In the game, she is infected by a runner instead of a clicker, as seen in the show, but she eventually dies at the hands of Fedra soldiers when she chooses to stay behind and hold them off so that Joel and Ellie could escape.
We know you're in there. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up.
What the f***? I can't believe we did that.
Stop.
We just left her to...
But the creators decided to switch up the situation in The Last of Us Episode 2 by replacing the soldiers with infected. Behind-the-scenes footage reveals that this change was made because the original death wouldn't have been as impactful and sustainable for the show. In Episode 2, they wanted to focus on the infected as the primary threat, which makes sense. In the show, while Tess still gets infected, her death is a bit more complicated than in the game. After Joel unintentionally warns the infected of their location, they begin to swarm into the Capitol building. Knowing that she's already been bit, Tess makes the decision to try and hold them off so that Joel and Ellie can make it out safely. She grabs several barrels of oil as well as hand grenades, ready to ignite a fire so none of the infected could make it out alive. This change actually manages to improve the storyline overall while still keeping the core beats of it intact. Tess's death isn't lost or diminished in any way. Instead, the episode feels much more coherent as a whole with this change. If the soldiers killed her, like in the game, it would have probably seemed too sudden, right? Like, that's just too abrupt for a television show that had already spent so much time building up the danger of the infected, especially since they made the infected way scarier. In the original The Last of Us games, when players encountered infected, they'd be exposed to clouds of spores caused by the cordyceps infection. This posed a challenge since it required players to equip gas masks in order to get through these dangerous sections of the game. But the showrunners of the HBO adaptation decided to change things up. Rather than having clouds of spores, they decided to introduce tendrils that actually better reflect how real-life fungi like cordyceps actually behave. The tendrils work like a massively interconnected hive mind, being able to sense and respond even when a potential host is miles away. In the show, this was perfectly illustrated by the horde in downtown Boston that started running straight for the State House, after Joel inadvertently alerted them of his presence with Tess and Ellie with him. On screen, this is more effective and scarier than having Joel and Ellie constantly put on gas masks. Even better, though, was what they did with Bill and Frank. If you ask me, one of the best changes HBO's Last of Us made was to Bill and Frank's storyline in the third episode. In the game, Bill was a minor character who simply provided Joel and Ellie with a car for their journey to Wyoming.
Look what I found. It's got some juice in it.
That's my battery. That fucking asshole. Get out. Get out.
Okay. Jeez.
HBO expanded on his backstory and made him a huge part of the story. In the TV series, Bill is a survivor who lives in Jackson, Wyoming, and has become emotionally isolated because of the events of the outbreak. He refuses to trust anyone or even leave his home until Joel and Ellie arrive. Through his relationship, he opens up to them, helping them repair their car so they can reach Tommy's settlement. Bill's death in the game had little to no impact because we really knew nothing about him, other than the fact that he was supplying Joel with whatever they needed. But the show gave him a backstory of how he got all the supplies in the middle of a zombie outbreak, how he met Frank, and how he ultimately died. Another difference made in Bill and Frank's story was the suicide letter. In the game, Frank got infected after they broke up. Instead of becoming an infected, he decided to take his own life instead. He left Bill a letter talking about how much he hated him in his final moments. But in the show, Bill is the one who leaves a note. After Bill and Frank decide to die together, Bill knew Joel would visit at one point. So he revealed everything so they wouldn't have to walk into that room and find out for themselves. This might seem like a small change at first, but it made a massive difference at the end of it all. Just like Sarah's introduction. The game introduces us to Joel and Sarah, his daughter, on the night of the zombie outbreak. We only really got to see a couple of scenes of the two interacting before Sarah died. On the show, we have more time to get to know their father-daughter relationship. We get to join them at their breakfast table, where they are trying to make small talk while avoiding the subject of pancakes. Then in school, you see Sarah trying to concentrate on her studies while her classmate keeps twitching in the background. We watch her pick out a birthday present for Joel, a watch that he would keep with him for 2 decades, even after its face is broken. One of the most unsettling moments in the show is when Sarah has a confrontation with her infected neighbor. While the basic details of Sarah's death remain unchanged, you have to admit, these added scenes make it even worse. Mason and Druckmann managed to keep her origin story largely the same, but they added just enough to make it even more heartbreaking. And that's how The Last of Us completes Joel's character.